Okay, I'm going to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal people here who are joining the seminar today. It's a really great honour to be able to host today's Doherty seminar and introduce Dr. Mark Sullivan. Mark I'll start with a conflict of interest. Mark is an old friend of mine. I first met Mark when I was working at the Department of Microbiology and Immunology back in the early 2000s. Some of you might not know, I did spend some time working here from 99 to 2003. And Mark, at that point, had his office based in the ground floor of the old DMI department, and at the time was heading an NHMRC program grant that in fact included Peter Doherty, if I remember that correctly, and a number of other investigators, Stephen Kent, Damien Purcell, David Cooper and others. And so I met Mark back then, so that goes back quite a way, and we've stayed good friends since that time. And it's just been wonderful to see what Mark has achieved in that period, 17 years. I met Mark then as a expert in drug development. He had spent a lot of time working in the field of virology, developing some key drugs actually for HIV and hepatitis B through his work in the UK for Burroughs Wellcome and then in the US with Gilead. But Mark's also passionate and idealistic, and he took all of that expertise in drug development for Big Pharma and established a company called Medicines Development for Global Health. And he's the founder and managing director for an extraordinary company, and it came from his extraordinary vision, but with the expertise to pull it off. And he indeed has pulled it off. MDGH is the world's only independent, non-profit biopharmaceutical company dedicated to addressing health inequity through developing and delivering new medicines and vaccines. And that sounds grand in vision, and it is, but actually what Mark was able to do was in fact be the first company to get FDA approval for a drug called moxidectin, and he'll tell you all about that story, I'm sure, which was then approved for the treatment of an unusual but important disease, onchocerciasis, in June 2018. And he's going to tell us the whole story, but it's an incredible story of drug development and then appropriate award for that. And there's this very interesting mechanism that now exists to reward these sorts of activities, because traditionally this doesn't attract funding. And so Mark was then a Victorian of the Year for this reason, and he is also a very close colleague of many of people here at the Doherty. I was just saying to Mark, I feel like he works at the Doherty because this is my third meeting with him this week. He is chairing the Scientific Advisory Board for the JAPMA vaccine grant. Many of you will know that JAPMA's funding work here at the Institute on COVID-19 vaccine development. Many staff engaged in that, led by Dale Godfrey, and Mark's kindly chairing the Scientific Advisory Board. He's also now joined the Executive Management Committee overseeing the conduct of ASCOT, large randomised study looking at antiviral treatments for COVID-19. So we've been using Mark's expertise extensively. He's been very kind and generous to us at the Doherty. I know he's very fond of Peter. That's probably why I can keep asking him to do things for us. And I have offered him an office here should he want it, but he looks like he's quite happy at home. Right. It's a very long introduction. Very pleased that we have Mark, and I'm going to hand over to Mark. We're running this as a webinar, so which means that you have the opportunity to raise your hand. I hope I can do this okay. Raise your hand at the end through the Q&A format, which means that I can allow you to ask a question. You can also type in your question on the chat dialogue, and I've got Kath here to help me in case I can't work it out, but I should be able to work it out. So I'm going to hand over to Mark. Welcome, Mark, and really great to have you present at our Doherty seminar.
Thanks very much, Sharon. That's a lovely introduction. I just want to check, can everyone hear me okay? And perhaps Sharon, if you could
I can hear you.
No, that's good. All right. Well, I assume everyone else can hear me okay. So thanks for that lovely introduction. I do this because of you, because of the friendship, but also because when I returned to Australia from the US in the early noughties, I was made to feel really welcome at the microbiology and immunology department, and I'm sure it must have been weird for a guy who knows what they do, but they're in an office, and I see Amanda's on the call as well, and Amanda and I were sitting down there, and I'm sure it was to most people a bit strange that somebody was working on pharmaceutical development and particularly vaccine development at that time. Within that department, but as I said, I was made to feel really welcome, and I'm really grateful for that that experience coming back from quite a long time overseas. So I have a real affinity for the work that the Institute does, and it's extremely important, and I'm really happy if I can do something to contribute to that objective. So today I have slightly changed the intent and the method because of the fact that we're doing this as a webinar like this because of the current situation. So if you're welcome to my home, and if you see a cat go past the screen, there are 3 of them, and they form very much part of pretty much every video conference that I have been doing over the past 8-9 weeks or so. So I'm going to do this slide free. I'm also going to do what's a relatively data-free presentation, which I know is, again, unusual for the types of seminars that you would normally have. They are normally quite deep on the data front. And the reason for that is a couple of things. One is that I had intended to go through in a lot of detail moxidectin as an exemplar, as a drug that meets an area of market failure as a potential new treatment, and how we achieve that. I will cover those elements, but also really there's so many aspects to this which are partly business and partly science. And the business side of it is really where the failing lies. And I think really in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we're learning a lot, and the experience is perhaps quite enlightening as to what our strengths and weaknesses are as a scientific community. If this is what it feels like to not have a treatment and to not have a vaccine. And that's a situation that most of the world has as its normal. There are 2 billion people who have no or very poor access to medicine, and they have diseases that are ultimately quite curable. So we've got something wrong in the system. And I think COVID-19 and the moxidectin story speak to that issue. So like I said, it's going to be relatively data free, and I'm just going to talk through a few of the different issues that I see, and also a potential solution, and I think how we as a society need to deal with it. So here is cat number 1 entering the frame. Thank you. It's real life. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about the company, just a small amount about the company, but then I'm going to examine what it is that we've achieved globally in the addressing of human health needs, and then why I think that situation has arisen. And I have a potential solution to that. And laced throughout this entire story is the story of moxidectin. So let's start with the company. Sharon did a lovely start. I formed the company when the funding that Sharon mentioned ran out, and I saw a need for my expertise as a developer of pharmaceuticals. And really, I come from a clinical research background and have now become a broader project leader, drug developer. And I'll explain a little bit about the differences and that functionality as we go through the presentation. So the company was set up in 2005. I set it up as a not-for-profit. I could see that there were a lot of potential opportunities where in an academic setting, such as in yours, where there is a need or a desire to develop really promising and interesting intellectual property, or for that matter, another way to look at it is to kill it off quickly so that you can shift your efforts, focus on something else that's likely to succeed, you know, just general life cycle stuff. So the principles and methods that I've been trained in, I could see those being quite useful. So I set the company up and I thought we could fund ourselves by providing our expertise to local biotech companies who need drug development expertise like anyone. And at the same time, keep our eye open for intellectual property that might be of use and of value in low and middle income countries. The passion for all of this comes from working on HIV particularly, and hepatitis B as well. My experience is in the early 90s in both of those diseases, and particularly HIV, which was at that time a disease that many of you know far better than I do, was a death sentence. And one of the things that came with diagnosis was a instruction to get your affairs in order. And the treatments were sparse. They were not sophisticated. We had a long way to go. And it was a very helpless feeling at the time. And during the period of time that I worked on HIV as a product developer, working on 3TC as a very junior scientist, very young at the time and junior, saw the disease transform from something that you died from to now something that you live with. So that has always stayed with me. And also the other massive learning, which is very different to any other disease area I've worked in, the learning at that time was the involvement of patients in that process, that ability to speak with the people who were affected by the disease and understand what was motivating to them and what their issues were, and how, you know, the pill burden of a protease inhibitor of 20 tablets per session was ridiculous and needed to be fixed. So there are things you can do and you can't do, but we knew that we wanted to save lives and then improve lives. And it's the pharmaceutical medicine that has achieved that difference in that disease. Same for Hep C, to a large extent, hepatitis B, and we could go on. So those are some pretty motivating things, that to be able to develop a medicine can change many lives. And then as you look at, to the left of the equation, if you look at gross domestic product across the bottom of your x-axis, and we live over here on the right where there's a lot of money around. For everyone else who lives over here on the left, then their access to medicines is patchy at best, and that's problematic for me. It's problematic for all of us. So that's why I formed the company that I did. And so we have really focused our attention as an organization on applying our expertise into disease areas that we regard as neglected or underserved, and trying to do our best to address that. So if we look at what we've achieved, this is cat number 2, by the way. Hello, everyone. I'll just get rid of this in a nice way. If we look at our achievements, if we look at what we're doing as a society, still cat number 2, go away, thank you. If we look at our achievements, I will continue with this, and so will the cat. There are, hang on. So there are approximately 40 new chemical entities, totally novel drugs, approved by the US FDA every year. So that seems like a reasonable number. That's not a bad tally, and that's the average. It's 30. It's just under 40 over the last 10 years, and that data is available from FDA.org. They publish what's been approved and when it's been approved, and they focus on the new chemical entities as well. New chemical entities is another way of saying something completely novel. It's not a reformulation or anything like that. It's something that is first time that it's ever been approved. And so 40 is our output as a global society. Mostly that's for diseases that affect higher income countries, and that's because it's really very, very expensive. It's the total expenditure by just the pharmaceutical industry on R&D is about $170 billion US dollars per year. And if you think that's inconceivably large money, I'm really happy to provide you with all the citations that I give in this talk. But it's a real number, and it is a vast number. And part of the reason for that is that success rates are relatively low on pharmaceutical development. There are things that you can't change about a drug. It just is the structure that it is, and it has the effect that it has. And your job as a drug developer is to reveal that, to generate the data that shows what it's good at, what it's not good at, where its problems are, what it's like to manufacture it, and so on. You're characterizing all aspects of this drug to present to somebody else. So that's the process that you go through. It's a very expensive and long process. But if you look at the vaccine environment, there are currently approximately 100 vaccines currently approved for human use by the US FDA. And of those that are approved, that cover roughly 40 different diseases. Now that's the sum total of the entire human effort of vaccine research and development. So these aren't vast numbers, and it tells you that vaccine development is harder than drug development. And then you go down to some of the other different areas, such as you know, the reformulation. It's a lot easier to do that. It's not nothing, but it's a lot easier to do that and to achieve that. Devices, diagnostics are again a whole different level of effort and achievement, and then there are things that are semi-regulated or worse, unregulated, and the semi-regulated might be things like vitamins. They might be some of the complementary medicines. That's not the world that we live in. That my work is. My work is in the regulated pharmaceutical sector. And it's important that we do think as well about the differentiation of those different aspects, that a regulated pharmaceutical is what we're talking about, and it is such a different environment from the semi or unregulated areas. So I said now we've had 40 new drugs per year. We have 100 vaccines that are registered with the FDA. I always talk about the FDA because the FDA is probably the most sophisticated regulatory authority on the planet. It's the best resourced. It sees almost every drug and every vaccine. And so it's a very good central source of information. So when you start to look then at the diseases of market failure, things like antimicrobial resistance, pandemic preparedness, and diseases that are regarded as neglected and listed by the WHO as such, which affect people who live in poor countries. We've only have 10 new agents for neglected tropical diseases since 2008. That's 10 total, which tells you that the moment you step out of that higher income country focus, this whole process falls to pieces. And pandemic COVID-19 has revealed that for everyone. And the reason this is the case is because the skill set to do the development that's required lives almost 100% within the pharmaceutical industry. That is its business. And perhaps your experience of working with pharma might be with some of the sales and marketing people domestically, health economics. There might be other aspects of your interaction through working with head office. But I can assure you that the organization is built around its R&D hub. That is the success and failure of a pharmaceutical company. The rest of it is almost from when I worked in R&D, we would throw it across over the fence to the commercial department, who would then carry on to commercialize once we got through approval. So you've got a very sharply focused R&D machine, and that's what they do. That's their skill set. They take the proof of concept that often comes out of an academic setting and turns that into a product. I have really tortured analogies about this, which some of them might include things like the airline industry, of turning a concept of an aircraft into something that Boeing sells to Qantas and flies. And you can imagine what it takes in terms of R&D and manufacture capability to achieve that transition. Maybe that helps as a visualization, maybe not. So that's the world in which we live in. We really have only one route by which we can get a medicine out there, and it's through the pharmaceutical industry. And before we sort of think, well, how did this happen? Why is this the case? I mean, it's expensive. It has to self-fund. And when you think about it, you know, pharmaceutical industry is there to generate a profit. It has to, by law, generate a profit. They are shareholder, or some of them are private, but almost all of them are shareholder owned. And in fact, I did a little search. This is my PowerPoint presentation. I did a little search on UniSuper, knowing that my superannuation is with UniSuper, as I'm sure it is for many of you, that you're also in the pharmaceutical industry. Your investment future and the return on that is dependent on their success. So number 8 in the list of Australian shares is CSL on UniSuper, and number 18 on international shares is J&J. I also, because I did live and work in the UK for 11 years, I'm sure my pension is wrapped back up in my old company, GSK, or in AstraZeneca, or, you know, it's just an inevitable part of life. These organizations have to make money. And so at the moment, the only other ways that you can do development are through some of the product development partnerships that have been set up to deal with, say, tuberculosis or malaria, and DNDi, who deal with a number of neglected tropical diseases. But all of them also have to have a pharma partner in order to further their project. Some of them they can do a little bit on their own. Mostly they have pharma partners. TB Alliance's recent approval is probably one of the exceptions to that. And I've not yet found, and I perhaps challenge you to find an academic-driven approval of a medicine. I've looked back a long way to try and see, were there any examples and are there learnings that we could take from that? I have not found one yet, so that would be great too. So in order for us to understand why we're in this situation, we need to understand what it is that the pharmaceutical industry does. And it's what I do. It's my role in life. So let me perhaps just go through a little bit of the detail of what's involved. And I thought perhaps I would do that by having a quick look at what it is that the regulator asks for and how the regulator approaches this. Because we could talk about you know, the work that we do to generate work for a regulator, but essentially what we're doing in our role is serving the regulator with the data that they need. And this is an important distinction between public health and public health objectives and regulator and regulatory objectives. They're really quite different. And this separation also creates a problem in the development of our medicine. It means that it's really hard to develop a pediatric formulation. It costs tens of millions of dollars to do that. So people sometimes won't do it. It also means that we end up with data where we don't know whether we can or we can't use a drug in pregnancy, in breastfeeding, because it's very hard to generate that data. And so we're ending up with partial information that serves the regulator, but doesn't always answer the questions for treating physicians to know, how do I use this medicine? That's one of the flaws in the system. But on my next slide, I can describe for you, and this is available on the FDA website. It's actually a really nice PDF that runs through the reviewer's guide, what a reviewer, for the FDA, but they make it public, what a reviewer does when they're going through a new drug application. And so in general, what they do is they have a various sized team. Generally, the team on the FDA side is between 40 and 70 people who are dedicated to your project. So the review cycle is generally 10 months. If it's what they call an accelerated review, that drops to 6 months. But in general, it's a 10-month review, and there's 2 additional months before that, which are for them to review the file to make sure you've got everything, you've ticked every box. And then what they do is they assign an overall reviewer. The primary reviewer, the overall reviewer, is usually a physician, a public health physician, who will lead across all of the disciplines. So that's the project leader. And so I am the project leader from my side, and the interaction is really across the table. You go into the FDA, they are lined up on the other side because we're only a small non-profit. There are usually about 6 of us on our side, and there's usually about 40 to 50 people on the other side of the table. Very weird experience, but it's the project leader to project leader conversation that happens, and they'll only call on their expertise as needed, and we do the same. So the expertise that sits behind that Pharmacology, toxicology, so that's really a key person in their review, and they have a team that sits underneath that lead. Product quality or manufacture, again, any of these that are not right will cause the entire application to fall apart. Biometrics or statistical support, so the biometrics and statistical team are probably the crucial team in the entire process. They reanalyze every piece of data that you send in by their own methods. And so your job is to try and predict what analyses they'll do and do them in advance so that you understand what they're going to see as well. Clinical pharmacology, clinical microbiology for the disease areas of interest for us, infectious diseases. A group who deal with study endpoints, that's all they do. And a group that does with label development. The label is the prescribing information. That, again, is all they do. There's also always a pediatric and maternal health member of the review committee who will look at any aspect of your program that deals with pediatric or maternal health, and that happened with us. There's also a QT, IRT group. So with hydroxychloroquine, of course, has a QT liability. So each program is reviewed against its QT liability, and it is expected you will do a QT study as part of your submission package. We argued that we didn't need to do it because our drug has no liability, moxidectin. They didn't agree, so they made us do it anyway. And that's kind of, generally the level that you get, which is do it. There's also, believe it or not, they're called a medication error group. When you have a proprietary name, which we don't, we've only got a generic name, moxidectin, but when you have a proprietary name, there's a group who will write it out in usual doctor writing, which, no offense to the physicians amongst you, is not always super clear. And so they will look for any chance of misprescribing and then reject your proprietary name if you have one. So that's an important review. There's also a risk management analysis group who are looking at the relative risk, and that's of course what we do as well. There are compliance. I could go on. I mean, the list is quite substantial, and each one of them has a responsibility. And so there's an audit group, and the audit group falls into two different categories. One category will review your manufacturing, and they will go to the facility. So at the beginning of 2018, I was in San Francisco. I had a call from our manufacturer who were in Fort Dodge in Iowa. And this is January, so chilly time of year in that part of the world, that the auditor was coming. They give you usually a day to 2 days notice, sometimes not even that. They can just knock on the door and go in. So I flew over from San Francisco to Iowa, and I sat there while the FDA auditor, they bought their own lunch. They will not accept food or drink from the company, and they will sit there for a week, and they'll go through every single batch you've ever made and cross-check against the standard operating procedures of the facility. And then 2 weeks after that, I had a call from Geneva saying that we're going to be audited for the clinical side. So they firstly went to one of our clinical sites in Ghana, and then went to Geneva. And so we brought all of our data over to Geneva and had the review there. And again, they will go through every single aspect of your trial. And what they do look for is that if you are reporting a hematology value, a hemoglobin value of 10.1, that the 10.1 is in somebody's notes, that appears in the case report form that you're collecting the data, that appears within the listing that's for that report, and that appears then in the summary reports that sit above it. So there's a traceability all the way through. And if someone changed it from 10.1 to 10.3, there's a change record of who did it, when they did it, and why they did it. And so you need systems that deal with that level of detail. I'm going through this to try and illustrate what it takes to develop a medicine and why it costs so much money to do. There are so many aspects to this that have to be covered. And unfortunately, and I presented this, sort of similar kind of discussion at the Kirby Institute in Sydney. And somebody who I know very well, who's a statistician, said, I really just can't be bothered with all of that. And I thought, completely get it. I do understand that, because a lot of this stuff it doesn't do anything to the science. It doesn't change the scientific perspective of what it is you're generating. What it is layering a quality handcuff over the work that you're doing so that it's verifiable all the way through. And that's time consuming, painful. It appeals to the OCD in me, but it is time consuming and painful and expensive. So it doesn't matter what our opinion is of it, that's what a regulator requires. And when you make your submission to the FDA, you have to sign, and it's legally binding. So you end up in jail if you sign and it's not accurate, that you have complied. So it's an interesting process to go through. In the interest of time, I won't talk about the advisory committee, but it's a very, very big public forum. And if you ever get the chance to look at an advisory committee, they're generally broadcast live and you can watch them. And it's company and FDA with people of Professor Lewin's caliber sitting in the middle, kind of giving their expert opinion about what they see. And it's a very interesting judicial process that is, again, as I said, a very public process. And then, so, you know, that's what you're going through when you make your submission. There isn't anywhere to hide here. You can't have any aspect of your program that you haven't gone to the bottom of, shone the light in every corner and understood. And if you don't do that, you will be in trouble and it will be revealed pretty quickly. Those 60 to 70 people who are reviewing that, and in our case, it was about 60 to 70 people, they are sharp, they see a lot of drugs, they know exactly what they're looking for, and they will dive in and they will expect you to know answers to their questions. And so the format of the data that you present to them is very open. And this is, on my next slide, a list. And this is, again, publicly available. Whenever you want to know something about how you do anything to do with developing a drug, you just type in guidance for industry, FDA, and then your question. And there generally will be a guidance for industry. So this one tells you what it is you've got to prepare. And we only really talk about, there are numbers down here on the left, 252, 272, a 27, a 256. Those numbers to us in industry mean something. They are summary documents that wrap up various parts of the program. One of them deals with biopharmaceutics. One of them deals with why did you develop this drug in the first place? One of them deals purely with efficacy. One of them deals purely with safety. And then there's an overview of risk and benefit. All of this has to be written up and very coherent and very accurate. You cannot make a mistake. You know what it's like when you lose credibility. If you put an error into a document, you then start to question where the other errors are. So it is imperative that your data is accurate and clearly articulated. There's a lot of art in what we do, and it's partly to do with this. And I'll just mention as well the integrated summaries that are prepared. So generally, many of you will know that in order to get a drug approved, you need 2 well-controlled trials. The FDA defines what a well-controlled trial is. And so for us, we prospectively design those studies and report on them. And the idea is that you have 2 well-controlled trials, because if you use a 0.05 p-value cutoff, there's still a reasonable chance that you get a false positive or a false negative. And so you do 2 of the trials, because that then reduces the risk of that happening to a much greater extent. So if you end up with a drug that is marginal in its efficacy, one might be positive, one might be negative, then that's it, you're done. So you're looking for 2 studies that concur with each other. You don't get to do this stuff again, by the way. You design it prospectively, you execute on it, and then it is what it is. And the moment you're into the data mining, fishing around, you're done. It's over. So that is a kind of an important principle. The integrated summaries take those 2 data sets, and it's the only time that I'm ever going to talk about any kind of amalgam of data in any positive way. So the amalgam of data is done at the raw data level, put together, and then you design your analyses, and then you rerun the analyses, integrating the 2 studies. And in fact, you often integrate more than 2 studies, and then you produce your listings based on that. So it's a pretty complicated, detailed process for generating the evidence that goes to a regulator. But also important to say that that the clinical side of things, we tend to just think about this as clinical trials. It's just clinical trials. And I'm a clinical researcher. I thought about it as clinical trials. And as a project leader, I can tell you clinical trials might scratch 40% of the total body of data. I would say that 30 to 40% of the data set is in the manufacturing, and it's the thing that'll kill you at the end of the day. I won't have time to go into the detail of why that's the case, but the complexity in manufacture, the complexity in clinical pharmacology, in toxicology, and all of this lines up in a way that supports the dose that you've chosen, and you have to work that through pretty carefully. I've had a look at the venetoclax data set because it's kind of independent of anything that I've done. And, in the submission, all available on the FDA website, are there modeling and all of the different studies they've done, how they've analyzed the data, doing the things that that I will often just repeat over and over again. And I feel for poor Sharon is going to have to listen to me talking about this over and over again, which is PK/PD relationships, pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic relationships. Drugs are nothing until you have established what that PK/PD relationship is. And until you have nailed that, the rest of it is a waste of time. So that is going to be my mantra. It's always my mantra. It's every drug developer's mantra, is that clinical pharmacology is really the driver of this entire process. So passing through the eye of the needle, which is the regulatory process, is essentially putting together a body of data that meets that need. So I'll go quickly screaming back to the moxidectin story. So moxidectin was a drug that was originally a veterinary medicine developed in the 80s and has become one of the largest veterinary medicines on the planet. It's a second generation form of a drug called ivermectin, which again, many of you know, and has some interesting characteristics that are potentially quite beneficial, one of which is it's got a much longer half-life, which in a global health setting is really very desirable. Has questions then about safety profile given the longer exposure. It's more like a micro dosing over a long period of time rather than daily dosing of a drug. So we looked obviously into that in great detail. So the drug was originally developed for its veterinary use by a spin-off of Wyeth called Fort Dodge Animal Health. And then the Tropical Diseases Research Group, led by a couple of people who are no longer there, but people who are really quite visionary, thought that it would be good to see if a second treatment for onchocerciasis or river blindness would be of value. And so that approach was made, and Fort Dodge handed it over to their human health company, Wyeth, who said, sounds like a great idea, and development began. And so the Tropical Diseases Research at WHO brought the field expertise and the capability to do clinical trials in remote locations where the disease is endemic, and Wyeth brought the stuff that I just mentioned, the clinical pharmacology, the manufacturing, and so on. In 2009, Wyeth was bought by Pfizer, and over the next couple of years, Pfizer decided not to continue the development of moxidectin and handed some funds and data, all of the data, over to TDR and said, it's not for us, it's for you guys to take it on from here. And therein lies another great example of market failure, that the people who have this disease live in sub-Saharan Africa. The current standard of care, ivermectin, and I see Hugh Taylor's on this. Hugh was instrumental in the development of this medicine, ivermectin, and it's an amazing drug, an absolutely amazing drug, one of humanity's greatest achievements. So, the thought was, well, what does a drug like moxidectin add to that, and why should we continue? So Pfizer pulled out. You could be asking the question, if there was a disease endemic in the United States, would that have been the case? I suspect the answer is no. But this is the situation that we are dealing with. And the reason we don't have drugs for the left side of our theoretical graph of wealth. So it turns out that moxidectin is superior to ivermectin at every dose studied, 2 milligram, 4 milligram, and 8 milligram, compared to the current standard of 150 microgram per kilogram of ivermectin, superior to all of those doses. It affects everyone. It does it for longer. It is a very clean safety profile. It's looking like a pretty amazing drug. And it is amazing that a not-for-profit from Australia interested in this drug for scabies approaches the Tropical Diseases Research and said, what are you doing with the drug for scabies? And they said, well, actually, we don't have a partner at all. Would you be interested in taking it on? So that all happened in 2013. At the end, we did our diligence on the drug. We could quickly see that the drug was highly efficacious and had a really good looking safety profile. Our questions were, could you make it? What did the clin pharm data set look like? Did we have all the tox information? Ticking all of the boxes that I just went through. And there was some data that was missing that we needed to repeat, that we needed to update, but we went through that process. And so we made the submission end of 2017 and were approved in June 2018 for this drug. So where we go from here with moxidectin is we are now beginning the scabies program. We've started that now in Darwin, and we have 3 sites in France in a scabies dose finding study. We're also looking at field studies of moxidectin in onchocerciasis or river blindness. In Africa, we're doing a pediatric program. But we've got a lot of work going on. Now, I'm sorry that I'm skipping the detail of that and any description of onchocerciasis itself. It's a really interesting story, and it's a really interesting area, which is how do you introduce a new medicine when your current drug is so loved but doesn't work in everyone, and the new drug is new and does work in everyone. And that's what we're working with various people, including the Gates Foundation, on right now, on how do you do that? Because we're all humans at the end of the day, and there's comfort in what we know. So we're going to have to work gently and appropriately with the field to introduce this medicine and accelerate the elimination of this disease. So as you think about this process and this example of a drug that was an absolute slam dunk, moxidectin is as obvious as it could be, and yet has a tortured history, and it ends up in the hands of a group. At the time we were just 11 people, and really shouldn't have been in the frame for a medicine like this. That tells you as well one of the issues here on this question of market and market failure. So I think in sort of beginning to kind of conclude where we go from here, for me, there are a couple of questions that sort of exist. One of which is the way that we approach clinical trials, the way that we approach product development is really bifurcated by the purpose. The purpose when it's regulatory is very different. And you know, a clinical trial I personally run, it's around 100 trials. I can't exactly remember now how many trials I've run and designed. And I'm the person who sits in head office in these companies and designs these trials to fit in with the story that I'm building about the evidence for this drug. But it's for the regulator. It's not naive to the context of clinical medicine and how the drug will be used. And we have advisory groups to help keep us on the straight and narrow. But our role here is to make sure that the endpoints we choose, the statistical methods that we choose, that the objectives that we set, there aren't too many of them, because you then start to split out. If you keep analyzing the data, you'll get a significant result. P-values will come. And if somebody famously said, if you torture the data, it will surrender. That's something you can't do in my world. And so the approach that we have leaves, I think, a lot of unanswered questions in public health, because we are necessarily focused on getting through that eye of the needle at the regulator. And the other thing is that, you know, peer review is not regulatory review. It's not the same. Nobody has gone through the detail that a regulator will go through. So we have different purposes for these studies. They're very complementary to each other, but understanding that difference helps with what it is we're trying to deliver. So for me, as I think about COVID, and I think about onchocerciasis and the other neglected diseases that we want to address, one of the major issues here is a question of ownership. And if you look at hydroxychloroquine studies that are going on right now, I did a little search on COVID-19pharmacology.com, which is a resource set up by the Gates Foundation. They have a clinical trial tracker. There are 238 trials in using hydroxychloroquine. And if they are fully recruited, there'll be 200,000 patients. Now, when you download that data set, which you can easily do, the numbers actually, for reasons that, again, databases, one has to be careful about them. So, in fact, the total number of trials that comes up using hydroxychloroquine is 1,376 and involving 1.184 million patients. So our question as a society for hydroxychloroquine is, does it work? Does it work at what dose? And does that dose cause other harm? And so then you're nailing down on who is the population who will benefit from this drug, and how do we identify them, and how does it sequence with other potential treatments that might follow once this becomes an immunologically driven disease rather than a virologically driven disease. These are all questions we all have, and because the hunter-gatherer kind of approach has gone in, people are trying to do the right thing here. They're trying to make treatments available, but we also need to address these fundamental questions to know whether or not this is worth doing. And that's an important aspect. So we've got some issues revealed in our ability to develop medicines for events like this where we don't have any leadership. And so that for me is one of the problems. It kind of calls to me this question which I kind of wanted to pose to you, which is about the private versus the public aspect of pharma. And we're all pretty comfortable with the fact that here in Australia, we pay taxes to make sure that there's a safety net of health for people who can't afford it. And, you know, you could ask me for more tax, I would make other sacrifices to pay that, because I see that as incredibly important. I see health as a basic human right. And I know that's something that will be shared by all of you. So that's fine. And if I want to have a lovely room on my own that is protected and has a nice television in it, and I don't have the flatulence of my neighbor disturbing my sleep at night, then I have that right as well, and then I pay for that benefit. But at the moment in pharma, we only have a private solution. We have some public. There's a handful of us out there, and I mean a handful. It's very small. Our budget's tiny, and yet sort of we all believe there should be better medicines and more medicines for these diseases where there's no market. We should have had remdesivir stockpiled. We should have been working on the oral formulation years ago, and we should have been working on the development of a vaccine. And it's only because it affects us and now that we're working on these things. Those are things that should be done at risk. Those things should be stuffed on a shelf and be available for when the worst happens. And there are a whole bunch of diseases where people can't afford to pay for the drugs. So do we let them suffer, or do we step in and help and make a contribution by developing a new medicine? And for me, the answer is pretty obvious. For our scabies program, we're trying to do a little bit of both of these things, where we are focusing on the regulatory side of things, but we're opening up to collaborations with others to address public health questions that are needed. And that for me was what a public pharma can do. So I think the dialogue around the pharmaceutical industry and around how we serve the delivery of medicines and vaccines needs to be broadened. COVID-19 provides us with that opportunity. Moxidectin also provides us with an example of what can be done. It's not been an easy road, but we did get there. And we are the first not-for-profit in the world to have a drug approved, a novel drug approved through the FDA on our own. And we've shown it can be done. And for me, it's such a glaringly obvious and important issue for us to address that we certainly can't do it on our own. And a lot of this stuff will make people glaze over, which is understood. But for me, it's such an important need that I think we need a different solution to questions like this. So thanks for your attention. It's very weird. I'm just talking to my computer. I know you're all there, but I'm very happy to have your questions.
Thanks, Mark. Really fantastic, inspiring, lots of challenging questions, and also great insight into what it takes to develop a drug. I mean, we all trot out in our grants that we're working on developing a medication or a vaccine, but the reality is very different once, as you've really brilliantly described. So we have an opportunity for questions. I think you can put up your hand through Zoom, and I then can see who's asking the question. Or you can say you'd like to ask a question on the chat format. I actually can't see how, on my view, how you can put up your hand, but so you can always put something on chat, and then I will either repeat the question or ask you to speak. So while we're waiting for questions, I just had 2 questions, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the model that we use? Post-COVID-19, people are going to be very open to, I think, radical new ways of doing things, of developing drugs, developing vaccines, being prepared. Having had a pandemic of this scale, it is going to be an opportunity with our government, with other governments, to rethink the model. Yeah, what's the model that we could build a publicly focused, public good focused entity that does the sort of work that you're describing?
I think I'm giving this a lot of thought and writing a piece on it at the moment. And I think the model, so if you look at all of the roadblocks that exist, the approval process, I understand that. And there are others, there's not that many of us around the world. It's probably about 1,000 people who've led a program through, if you look at those numbers of drugs that go through. There's not zero, but there's not a massive number, but they're out there. One of the major issues is the manufacture side of things. Who manufactures something at scale and delivers it? And then how is that funded? And our model is to, we contract our manufacturer, so they work under our contract, and that's done in the US, as I mentioned. And then we fund it hopefully through a dual market opportunity. So if we can make money out of those of us who are wealthier and have scabies, then we will charge them. But that money, because of our structure, is tied into delivery of the medicine back to those who can't afford it. And I think that model could be helpful. I think if we address a manufacture capability first and foremost, the hubs is almost virtual of product development, so that perhaps TB Alliance, Medicines Malaria Venture, DNDi, us, others who are interested, even pharma, their global health arms, could develop their products and then channel them through a manufacturing capability. There's a lot of virtuality in all of this. And I think that's the best way to manage the need for flexible resources that move. But I think getting the manufacturing sorted and providing a means, a little bit like Gavi does and CEPI do, where you have oversight committees for vaccines that provide a means of funding the purchase as well as funding the development in a coordinated manner with skill set. That's the model that is worth us looking at. In a way that does happen with flu vaccines, for example, doesn't it? Exactly. Yes, it does. I think vaccines are leading in a way, because there are fewer of them. Vaccines are leading in a way that the medicines, the small molecules, are not. It's all very disjointed in the small molecule area. And so those two, I think the vaccines provide us with a model that we could follow with drugs.
And the other question I just thought I'd ask you is, you didn't mention the voucher and what happened and the reward for going in this area. I know you're being modest, but I do think it's really worth mentioning it, because it does tell people, how you can, that there's a viable path here for career path, for commercial path, etc. So just tell us the story about the voucher.
Yeah, so the voucher is short for the Priority Review Voucher, which is a reward that the US FDA provides for developers of drugs in their list of neglected diseases. So they have their own list. It includes some rare pediatric diseases as well. And if you are the first to get a drug approved through the US FDA, and it has to meet a number of other qualifying criteria. But what they do is they provide you with a priority review voucher. And the priority review voucher, I mentioned before that the standard review is 10 months, the short review is 6. So what the voucher does is entitles those who are going to go through a 10-month review to go through a 6-month review. And drugs that are successful will make billions of dollars. So saving 4 months off that review cycle, so you're on the market 4 months earlier, is worth a lot of money. Now, the first of these vouchers sold for a maximum of $350 million US. And then more and more of them came on, particularly through the pediatric diseases. So we sold ours to Novo Nordisk, a Danish company. We did receive one. We sold it to Novo Nordisk. I can't tell you how much we sold it for, but the current selling range is between 80 and 120 million US dollars. And that's a reasonable expectation of our selling range. So we now repaid all of our investors who we borrowed money from to get the work done that we didn't really go into a lot of detail on, but we repaid all of them plus an upside, and then we have now our own funds to carry on the work. So it's an amazing, amazing mechanism.
Yeah, incredible, and incredible that you achieved that. I think the only person ever in Australia, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, amazing. Well done. I'm going to hand over to Kath because I actually can't see the questions from how I'm logged in. So I apologise if I've been ignoring each of you. Kath.
Hello, everyone. Damien Purcell, you've got a question.
So thanks very much, Mark. It was fantastic presentation. And you sort of answered the first part of my question with your answer to Sharon's about CEPI as the closest model. But I want to ask you specifically about the funding for CEPI. So it started out small, but seems obviously to have organically grown, and in particularly, dramatically grown in the recent climate. So are there lessons from that might transpose across to pharmaceuticals and therapeutic products, drugs?
Yeah, it's a good question, Damien. There are. This, as I've said a couple of times, this experience reveals what it feels like to not have treatment. And the reason we don't have treatments is because they would have just sat there. And so making a case to someone, if I want to spend $200 million developing a drug you probably won't need, generally doesn't go down terribly well. Well, I think we've all now experienced what that feels like. And that provides an opportunity, as people have brilliantly been philanthropic, who have dug in and countries have dug in to provide a mechanism for supply of funds to support this kind of work. And I think there is now an opportunity. It also does reveal the shortcomings in our current systems. The vaccine world is much better coordinated, and people don't know where to donate. I think you've all experienced that. I mean, the Doherty is superb at fundraising and being, really front and center, as it should be, of science and furthering science. But if you wanted to say, well, actually, what I really want to do is develop that product, where would you go? And it's fine when there's a pharma company who owns the product, then you just let them get on with it. But when that's not the case, where does the money go? Who do you donate to? How do you further it? And I think that's one of our great problems. So providing a means by which people can donate, a structure into which they can donate into diseases where there's this failure in the marketplace, I see as a really positive opportunity. Now I'm having a lot of conversations on this globally at the moment, and I'm getting the sense this is something that we really could get traction on.
So specifically, do you think that governments of wealthy countries should have a percentage tax essentially applied, that there should be a mandated formula for civil society to contribute, and philanthropy as the backstop that fills in the rest that's missing?
Yeah, sounding very left-wing there, Professor Purcell. I could possibly agree more wholeheartedly, though, that that we ought to be contributing more to global health. We ought to be contributing more to our medicines. We ought to be less reliant on the industry to come up with all of our answers, and we need a means by which we do that. And actually, I think industry is would be really keen to have a place where it could put its philanthropy, because at the moment it's people just looking at them going, come on, where's your drug? There was a thing in The Guardian the other day saying pharma knew about, or had the opportunity to invest in vaccines several years ago. Of course, it's always had that opportunity. Is it seriously going to do that when the vaccine would just sit on the shelf, or when it's a marginal disease and you're going to have to spend $1 billion on the vaccine? We're not being realistic about this, and we need to be just really frank with ourselves about what's working and what isn't. But if governments and those that are wealthy like ours can afford to put some money towards getting a medicine supply and giving back to a global community, even if you don't want to be selfish, then that's a fantastic thing. And we just don't have that mechanism at the moment.
I'm going to have to wrap things up now because we're just past the hour. Very stimulating conversation. A really great story, Mark.
Thanks.
Thank you for taking time to give the seminar today. I hope there's been lots of students listening to this, lots of people active certainly in developing drugs and vaccines for COVID-19 and many other areas, and hope you've got some ideas now of what it's going to take. Mark has been a fantastic advocate and for us and the work that we do here, and it is around also happy to help and advise on things we do. So thank you, Mark, and we shall finish up now. Thanks everyone for joining, and stay safe. See you later.
Thank you, everyone.